urban areas account for only 0.5% to 3% of our planet's total land area. However, they consume no less than 75% of the world's natural resources and energy.
Nomads, patriots of nature.
Nomads are the only human beings who day after day defend the rights of nature above all other interests, since they rely on the ecosystems they inhabit, being, at the same time, a part of it. United by mobility, nomadic peoples represent an anomaly in today's world, but an anomaly that is now more necessary than ever. This is a short story about those extraordinary human beings now vanishing. The people who, however, we all once were many years ago.
Origins.
Planet Earth, a 4.5 billion-year-old self-regulating system, the source and foundation of life in its many forms. And water, the essential element where life came from 4 billion years ago. But it took a very long time for hominids to appear. They emerged in a tiny fraction of time, just the last 0.15% since life first emerged from the water. However, it took another 3 million years for the first bipedal human prototype to appear. Over other 3 million years, humans gradually spread across the world, but, like their ancestors, they remained foragers. Whether hunting, fishing, or, mainly, gathering, these foragers did not fundamentally alter the territories where they decided to stay, which, in turn, regulated their dependent populations. As long as those humans remained foragers, relying on what nature provided, they continued to honour the ecosystems that sustained them, as if they were sacred entities. However, that long period was coming to an end, and with it that respect for nature, and the sense of being part of a whole, of a kind of ancestral mechanism painstakingly crafted over so many, many years. On an universal scale, agriculture emerged very recently, together with the Neolithic period, only some 10,000 years ago. Small-scale farming developed very gradually, but its new parameters were to have a huge impact on world history. Firstly, nature became a source of resources rather than being a homeland, something to be transformed in the pursuit of profit. This is how the concept of private property and surplus were born to change it all. In regions that were less fertile and less suitable for permanent settlement, agriculture remained small-scale, often supplemented by livestock farming and traditional hunting and gathering practices, and so its environmental impact was much less. Not so in the most fertile regions, where the population grew rapidly and became concentrated in increasingly dense urban centres. The larger cities gradually gained ground, establishing kingdoms and later states. These states expanded thanks to rapid population growth and increased exploitation of resources. And so, step by step, we have arrived at the present day. Meanwhile, our primate ancestors seem to be watching what we're doing to the planet, without really understanding it.
Pastoralism.
The people we refer to as nomads can be of many different types, whether in terms of their degree of mobility, the predominant economic activity they engage in, or the ecosystem in which they live. The usually used formal classification to separate nomadic peoples according to their economy, hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, etc., has its origins in 19th and 20th century European and American anthropology and ethnology. At that time, evolutionary historians and anthropologists established this typology to classify societies according to their stages of technological and social development. However, it takes into account only human beings and their practices, regardless of the ecosystems in which nomadism takes place. The classification continues within each group and each type of economy. Thus, amongst pastoralists, nomadic herders stand out. They move around throughout the year, though not at random. They usually live in tents, particularly in Asia, which serve as their sole dwelling. Others live in temporary huts made of branches and various types of roofing, sometimes reusing the internal structure for their next camp, which is more common in Africa. The strategic movements of nomadic pastoralists, as well as those of the semi-nomads, have varied according to the climate and available resources, and in recent times increasingly for external socio-economic reasons. Regions with extreme climates are often the setting for nomadic pastoralism, which in turn acts as a regulating factor for both the animals and the communities that depend on them. But such regions are a double-edged sword for pastoralists when climatic disasters occur with excessive frequency. In Mauritania, the nomadic population fell from around 80% to approximately 15% in the space of barely a decade. This sharp decline was due to the severe droughts that struck the Sahel during the 1970s and 1980s, which not only destroyed the traditional nomadic way of life, but also turned Nouakchott into the epicenter of the country's livestock trade.
Ça, qui s'appelle Selmou, ça. Il y a des marchés de chameaux, les châteaux, ça. Selmou.
Livestock markets are, in any case, one of the hallmarks of pastoralism, since, in addition to their undeniable economic role, for example in supplying animals to those who have lost theirs, they also fulfill a fundamental social function for communities living in remote areas, enabling the exchange of goods and information and facilitating exogamy in marital relationships. The recent social and economic, but above all political landscape represented by modern states is also a double-edged sword for pastoralists, because whilst it could function as a privileged channel for marketing their products in one direction, it can also be highly detrimental in the opposite direction. In 1980, the anthropologist Philip Carl Saltzman argued that the current situation of mobile pastoralists is largely a consequence of the consolidation of the state and the imposition of control, and that the crises faced by mobile pastoralists are not simply due to ecological or climatic factors, but to the process of political encapsulation by modern nation-states. 45 years on, this remains not only entirely true, but is perhaps even more evident. Nowadays, pastoralists combine traditional methods of transport with modern means, lorries and snowmobiles, but their livelihoods remain essentially the same. They live off their herds. On the contrary, animals do not need humans to survive. What they need is grass, or, in this case, lichens, the Cladonia rangiferina lichen, also called reindeer lichen. That, and moving from time to time, depending on seasons, to protect themselves from extreme cold events that sometimes leave the tundra encased in thick, impenetrable layers of basal ice, known to the Nenettes as Sirat. An understanding of natural cycles and respect for the animals that follow these cycles is common to all communities with a nomadic tradition, whether they are hunters, fishers, gatherers, or pastoralists. All of these groups must slaughter animals to survive, but whilst hunters minimize such slaughter by obtaining a much higher proportion of their diet from wild harvested produce, pastoralists do so through milking, which is another form of daily gathering. Milking takes place in the majority of pastoralist communities across the globe, mainly in the morning, like a frothy symphony of the relationship that humans have established with certain species of grazing animals, the final movements of which involve the transformation of milk into a range of consumable products over time. Its first movement always begins like this. Oops! It's just that there was one last bucket left to fill. We're living in strange times, in which scientific evidence is at odds with political action, as is clearly evident with the major issue of global warming. A time when, although festivals are encouraged to celebrate and support pastoralism as a distinctive way of life, the reality does not match that. Indeed, this is a reality in which matters concerning pastoralism and pastoralists, as well as other forms of traditional nomadism, are increasingly decided outside their own context, in the urban sphere, rather than within and by the natives' realms themselves. The vast majority of pastoralists are not nomadic, but rather semi-nomadic or semi-sedentary, encompassing a wide variety of intermediate forms. Transhumance is the least mobile of all forms of pastoralism, but it is of great ecological importance as it occurs in countries and regions that underwent early agricultural and industrial development, and consequently experienced land appropriation and urbanization. Its conservation is therefore vital to mitigating the negative effects of such development. Although transhumance also takes place in the Americas and Asia, as well as in Africa, it is in Europe that it finds its greatest cultural expression, particularly in mountainous regions. The Cantabrian Mountains and the Pyrenees in Spain, the Alps in France, Switzerland and Italy, the Balkans from Slovenia to Greece, and the Carpathians in both Romania and Ukraine. Since ancient times, European transhuman herders have witnessed the rise and fall of city-states, principalities, kingdoms, empires and states, and have continued to move with their flocks despite wars, just as they continue to do so today. It seems that the generational replacement is not under threat here, even despite the war, or perhaps precisely because of it. As always, dogs show up first when there are flocks nearby, although these seem quite friendly. The Hutsuls, as the indigenous people of these mountains are known, live in huts called stires, situated in poloninas, or high pasture areas, during the warmer months, below the highest peaks of the Ukrainian Carpathians. Here, aside from herding, shepherds gather mushrooms and berries, which they will sell in the surrounding villages. It reminds us that pastoralism is not a sort of monoculture, something that is particularly true of traditionally mobile cultures, where dynamism is not just a physical phenomenon, but also a matter of mentality. Other practices, similar to transhumance, actually have different origins, as these are modern adaptations of earlier nomadic pastoralist systems, which, for natural reasons or due to socio-political factors imposed from above, have derived in more strategic but less mobile forms. This is the case with certain Central Asian peoples, the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz, who are culturally and ethnically closely related to the Mongols, but with a different religion and varying degrees of Turkic genetic influence. Peoples who, in any case, also have a glorious past as horsemen that they look back on with fondness. In a different eco-social context, something similar could be said of the Bedouins, the legendary inhabitants of the deserts of the Middle East, whose nomadic traditions have now been severely eroded by a combination of factors. Notably, the almost exclusive focus on oil production in some countries, the priority given to the so-called adventure tourism industry in others, and the urban exodus of the younger generations, not to mention the armed conflicts in countries such as Iraq and Syria. It was in this region that the first settled civilizations flourished, and where, even from ancient times, the influence of Western powers was already evident. a factor that continues to be a source of endless conflict. With setting aside politics and economic and strategic interests, as well as the Bedouin culture of appearances, it is still possible to find some Bedouin groups who continue to live in the desert. Some have already settled around emblematic places, such as the Jebeliya tribe around Mount Sinai. Guardians of St. Catherine's Monastery, where according to tradition, Moses encountered the burning bush that spoke to him, that is, to God, they now have to compete with less artisanal forms of tourism. Further afield, there remain some vestiges of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples who, as in times past, live in tents, at least temporarily, and continue to depend, wholly or partly, on their camels, sheep, and goats. And yes, on other minor animals too. The Bedouins are also known for their hospitality, despite their conservative culture and the harshness of the desert. Meanwhile, in other parts of the region, the traditional Bedouin culture is virtually non-existent, or is confined to so-called safari shows, organised for tourists on the dunes not far from the cities, offering an authentic nomadic experience that is neither nomadic nor authentic in the slightest. But when it comes to regional conflicts and a better past, few contemporary examples are more dramatic than that of the Fulbe pastoralists in Africa. Also known as the Pul or Fulani, they are, in fact, the world's largest pastoralist ethnic group. Inhabitants of the Sahel since time immemorial, and certainly little known, they have maintained a tense relationship with their farming neighbours, a tension that has now worsened and become more radicalised due to the farmers' expansion into lands that were once under pastoral control. On the other hand, this opens the door to the process of settling down, moving from provisional huts to cottages, and from there to brick buildings, as herders seek to secure their access to land. Transhumance is still practiced in some parts of Asia Minor, for example, amongst the Yazidis of Aragat in Armenia, who, like other pastoral communities, combine the herding of goats and sheep with that of bees, but whose distinctive character and source of marginalization lies in the practice of the ancient Zoroastrian religion. We also find it in the Pontus region, where the Laz people combine it with tea production in the lowlands. Or in Tusheti, a region of the southern Caucasus, where the Tush people take their livestock there every spring, returning with them to the lowlands in autumn. However, as we move further east, transhumance gives way to the so-called yaylak system, a term which in Turkish refers to summer pastures, and which appears similar to transhumance, but actually has its origins in nomadic pastoral systems that have been adapted to changing social and political conditions. This process is still ongoing in Turkey, with groups such as the Yörük of the Taurus Mountains and the Konya Highlands or the various Kurdish tribes in the east.
Interconnections.
The world's most widespread religions are linked to the development of civilizations, but they all originated in nature. Christianity and Islam in the desert, Hinduism on the steppe, and Buddhism in the jungle. 5 centuries before Christ, Lord Buddha advocated the middle way, which lies between wastefulness and extreme asceticism, a principle that could very well apply today to reach a balance between conservation and development.
Do not take off your shoes. Do not take off your shoes.
Not too far from the birthplace of Buddha lives one of the last nomadic tribes of South Asia, the Raute. The Raute are an exceptional case in their stubborn determination to continue living as nomads, despite everything going on around them. Under the leadership of the community chief, or Mukhya, but operating by consensus, this group of hunter-gatherers survives thanks to its adaptation to its social environment. They obtain wheat and other cereals from the farmers in exchange for wooden bowls and for protecting them from attacks by macaques and langurs, which they traditionally hunt with their nets. The Raute describe themselves as the kings of the forest. They worship rivers and trees, and the deity known as Buya, the god of hunting, to ensure success in catching monkeys and gathering forest foods. Today, fewer than 150 Raute remain as nomads, preferring to live off and with the forest rather than from agriculture, but without the forest. But what will happen in the future? Leaving the lowlands behind, we follow the source of the rivers and the slopes that surround us in the real world, the natural world, without borders, only with those frontiers created in our minds. Along the way, we hear echoes of a past, when there were not as many transport or communication options as there are now, and oral tradition was fundamental, passed down by musicians and storytellers, such as this one from the Gaine or Gandharbha itinerant caste.
परम्परा यस्तै पर गरिसक्नु होला सारङ्गीको बिन्ती गदर मन नलिनु होला।
The tropical forests and plains gradually give way to steeper terrain and cooler forests, until you finally reach the high mountains, a landscape dominated by rocky terrain, almost devoid of vegetation, yet still teeming with life. From the Tibetan plateau, the Indus River carved its way through the Himalayas, giving its name to the Indian subcontinent. In this region, marked by territorial disputes between states, there lives a curious-looking community. Some say they are the descendants of the Aryan nomads who came from the steppes and conquered that subcontinent and beyond. Others say they are the descendants of Alexander the Great's soldiers who arrived here in ancient times. In any case, for the Aryans or Brogpas, the apricot-picking season is not yet over. Like many other mountain peoples, they make their living from a combination of small-scale farming, animal breeding, and gathering. Here, apricots symbolize a cultural crossroads, not only because of the Aryans, but also because the apricot trees in the region date back millennia and have historically been a source of food for those travelling along this branch of the Silk Road. Today, this region remains a cultural crossroads, because although the Aryans live under the spiritual influence of Buddhism, they find themselves caught between two powerful political religious forces, Hinduism and Islam. It is by following the course of the water that we come to discover those who live moving between both worlds, and who, although they belong to one of those worlds, are, above all, part of the very ecosystem they inhabit. Although scattered across the mountains, the Bakawal, together with the related Gujar, form one of the largest mobile pastoralist communities in Asia, with a current population estimated at between 1.5 and 3.4 million people. During the warmer months, these herders tend flocks of goats and sheep in the conflict-ridden region of Kashmir, either their own flocks or those of others, either under contract or through a profit-sharing arrangement. However, the capital of this cultural crossroads lies at a higher altitude. Here, in Leh, religious coexistence is embedded in a political and strategic context on the one hand, and a biocultural one on the other. Although it might seem at first glance that the social scene is dominated by one group or another, in reality it is someone else who is in charge. Everything in our world is interconnected, but this does not lead us into a state of confusion. Quite the opposite, in fact. In the past, nomads lived in greater isolation and with far more autonomy. But now that they have all been integrated into state-run projects, often subject to international political and economic speculation, it is essential to have an overview of the full context in order to understand them. No, we're not in Tibet, nor is this the Potala Palace, but Tiksi Monastery is known as the Little Potala, and Ladakh as Little Tibet. To understand what is happening here, a first step would be to identify which human species were the original colonizers and which are the invasive species, just as we would do in biological or zoological studies. The second task is to understand the bioclimatic dynamics of the ecosystem in question. In this case, the Alpine Desert, which, like all deserts, has oases where some farming is possible, and very arid areas where pastoralism is the only sustainable means of subsistence. Ladakh, or Little Tibet, is undoubtedly a biocultural part of Tibet, just as the Changtang on this side of the political border is part of the Great Tibetan Plateau. Some people, somewhat inaccurately, refer to the world's largest plateau as the Qinghai Tibet Plateau, even though it was formed a long time ago, and Qinghai was established as a province in 1928. Genetic studies suggest that the Tibetans originally emerged from groups of hunter-gatherers living on the fringes of the Tibetan Plateau, some 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, who gradually ventured to higher altitudes. Their integration into this very special ecosystem is so complete that they are the only ethnic group whose adaptation to high altitudes is encoded in their genes, as if it were a mark of territorial authenticity, just as it is for the yak, their totem animal. The wild yak is a species that diverged from cattle between 1 and 5 million years ago to colonize the high-altitude regions of Central Asia, where it could feed on alpine pastures, although its domestication dates back only some 2,500 years. However, the large Tibetan ethnic group is not, like other large ethnic groups in the world, entirely homogeneous. Rather, it comprises various groups and subgroups. Even amongst the nomads of Ladakh, there are such subgroups. The Rabo nomads and semi-nomads live in the territory of the Kiang, or Tibetan wild ass. They are so named because they still make their tents from yak hair, which they call rebo. Others simply describe themselves as Ladakhis, who are neither Rabo nomads, nor Tibetans, nor Changpas. Further north, there are groups of Tibetan refugees who were already nomads on the other side, when there were no sides yet. Then there are the Changpas of Rupshu and Neoma. To tell the truth, no country, and indeed no people, existed 55 million years ago, when the Indian subcontinent began to collide with the Eurasian plate, creating not only the Great Tibetan Plateau, but also the whole array of enormous mountain ranges that surround it, including the highest on Earth. We know that the sudden arrival of invasive species can have disastrous consequences for the balance of a given local ecosystem, which has been established over hundreds, if not thousands of years. The same is true of biocultural regions, and sometimes of an entire continent, as happened when the Spanish invaded the Americas, causing millions of deaths through the introduction of viruses against which the native population had no defences. Even today, in South America, it is estimated that there are some 180 groups of nomadic or semi-nomadic indigenous peoples who have no contact with the outside world, whether because of their remoteness or by their own choice, the majority of whom are located in the Amazon and Orinoco river basins. On another level, and perhaps not quite so harmful, the modern constraints to which nomadic peoples have been subjected lead them, so to speak, to damage their own biocultural regions through practices that are not particularly environmentally friendly, but which enable them to live within the new socio-economic landscape that has been created, and thus to cope with new costs, such as, for example, the education of their children in urban centres. If we apply Heisenberg's uncertainty principle to the social sciences, we realise that the presence of an external observer alters the very scenario he seeks to observe objectively. It is a very common picture in which we, the civilised ones, arrive in places we consider remote from our own point of reference, only to discover that this or that tribe does not provide formal education for its children. And so, we are shocked by this. But to get there, we have had to bring our entire arsenal of noise, engines, tools, and urban wisdom, just so that we can say, "Poor people, these children have no education." But we fail to realise that these people have received the education they needed to survive in their own eco-social environment. The knowledge they have learnt from their elders and from nature itself, whilst that environment remained untouched by other human beings who, it would seem, are more intelligent. Not to mention that certain observers arrive with their own ideas and projects, believing them to be superior, even without a thorough understanding of the new biocultural space they have entered. They frequently impose their own criteria, and do so because they feel they belong to a technologically superior culture. However, it is curious that in many science fiction films, regardless of their nationality, when aliens invade Earth and seek to take over certain countries, citing that very same technological superiority, the right to self-defense is then deemed entirely justified.
Mad idea of conquest now threaten their very existence, and drastic steps must be taken to prevent this dangerous act of aggression.
Coming back to Upper Ladakh, the case of the Changpa people and Pashmina goats is yet another example of biocultural degradation induced by an exploitative, external, political and market framework, fueled from outside by both Kashmiri middlemen and the Indian government itself, through the establishment of farms for these animals where none previously existed. It is well known that these ruminants' grazing behaviour is more aggressive than that of others, due to their ability to access roots and shrubby vegetation. Furthermore, goats do not produce manure that is easy to collect and useful, unlike yaks, whose manure herders use for cooking and heating. Consequently, they have to rely on the scarce shrubs available for fuel. Furthermore, goats require constant supervision to protect them from predator attacks, whereas yaks do not. However, as the industry is promoted from abroad, given the high demand for their wool on the international market, the cycle of ecological degradation continues in an ecosystem as fragile as that of the Changtang Alpine Desert, which is deprived of monsoon rains due to its location just behind the imposing wall of the Himalayas. And the herders, in need of more cash than before, are seeking that money. This is despite the fact that other animal fibres of similar quality are available, derived from yak or Bactrian camel hair. The latter was left there as a reminder of the means of transport used on the ancient Silk Road.
Laboratories.
We leave behind the arid lands of the Alpine Desert to explore the Himalayas. To do so, we could not have chosen a more impressive route than the Kali Gandaki, the deepest gorge in the world, whose river boasts the honour of being flanked by two 8,000-metre-high giants. Annapurna, and Dhaulagiri. However, before entering the fascinating world of the Himalayas, we must first understand its origins, because, like everything else in this world, geology, although it may sometimes seem immutable, is in fact dynamic, and its pieces are equally interconnected. As we have already mentioned, the drift of the Indian subcontinent caused a huge upheaval in the tranquil Eurasian continental plate, right at the start of the Eocene. Its movement completely transformed the geography and climate of that region, and far beyond, as we shall see. It was its most direct impact that raised the Himalayas, the most powerful mountain range on Earth, home to 10 of the 14 8,000ers, particularly in the Khumbu region and its surroundings, including Chor Oyu, Lhotse, Makalu, and Everest, the world's highest peak. And that force continues to this day, causing the mountain range to rise by around 1 meter every 100 years, whilst also triggering tragic earthquakes due to its intensity. As one tectonic plate subsided beneath the other, the Tibetan Plateau was uplifted as if it were a single block, with its southern edges forming high escarpments. This gave rise to the Kunlun mountain range in the northwest and the Qilian Mountains just to the north. But the tremendous pressure also affected the corners, which were dramatically fractured. To the right, the Hengduan Mountains rose up. At the left-hand corner, in the direction of the thrust, the Karakoram was the most affected area, where the colossal pyramid of K2 became the world's second highest mountain. But also, linked to the Karakoram, the Hindu Kush mountain ranges and the Pamir massifs emerged further to the west. But the scale of the collision was such that it rejuvenated distant mountain ranges, such as the Tian Shan in Central Asia, and, even further afield, the Altai-Sayan Mountains in Mongolia, and the edges of the steppe, extending as far south as the Siberian taiga. Over time, all these great mountain ranges gave rise to mighty rivers, eventually forming the world's most extensive fluvial network and a very distinctive climatic pattern, the monsoon. During the winter, the region of High Asia, together with Siberia, forms a large, high-pressure system that extends southwards and eastwards. But when the warm weather sets in, High Asia warms up, particularly the Tibetan Plateau, due to its massive size and high average altitude, which absorbs a huge amount of solar radiation. This attracts warm, moisture-laden southerly winds, bringing the monsoon, which ensures extra rainfall for the entire lowland area. And although this can sometimes cause severe flooding, it also leads to greater fertility and bountiful harvests. This, in turn, gave rise to densely populated civilizations in the fertile lowlands of South, Southeast, and East Asia, which today are home to more than half the world's population. Therefore, given its crucial environmental, economic, and climatic importance, this region, which was originally named High Asia, should be given further consideration at all levels. It is also one of the world's key biocultural regions for traditional mobile pastoralism, including nomads, semi-nomads, transhumant herders, and agro-pastoralists, all of them with a very long history behind. And if we extend this biogeographical and bioclimatic concept to what we might call Monsoon Asia, that is, the part of Asia most affected by the various monsoons, then we are also referring to many traditional mobile communities of hunters, gatherers, fishermen, itinerant horticulturists, and peripatetic groups. By zooming in and focusing our attention first on the central Himalayas and then on the Khumbu region, we obtain different but complementary findings, as we will then be able to include the essential biocultural element, which is constantly changing, particularly in recent decades. The ancient Bon religion, which was shamanistic and animistic in nature, due to the close relationship between the first human colonizers and the natural environment, was replaced by Buddhism, although it retained many of its elements in places where people continued to believe that nature itself was more important than priests and temples. This was the case with the Monpa, the original inhabitants of Bhutan, who remain attached to those ancestral beliefs, in a corner of the Himalayas divided between three countries, India, China, and Bhutan. But Hinduism was not to be outdone, also laying claim to particularly sacred high mountain sites, as the two most widespread religions in this part of Asia share many points of contact. Until the advent of rapid transport, and even today in many places, the way of life in the high Himalayas has been predominantly agro-pastoral, characterized by harsh living conditions due to the rugged terrain. With the rise of increasingly mass mountain tourism, the landscape has changed in some areas, particularly in the Annapurna region and above all in the Khumbu, where Everest attracts thousands of visitors from all over the world every year. Consequently, the Khumbu region is now a unique laboratory in which to observe, within a small geographical area, the interaction between three elements. The traditional way of life, centered on agro-pastoralism and deeply rooted in spirituality. The relatively recent policy on protected areas in second place. And finally, the arrival of new influences, represented by foreign tourism with its consequent economic impact, alongside a growing dependence on the capital due to shifting priorities, in terms of employment, healthcare and education, in the face of local constraints and what are considered, amongst the younger generations, to be activities that confer social prestige, or conversely, signs of provincialism. But in any case, Khumbu is still the sacred homeland of Sherpas, or, in Tibetan language, those who came from the east. The following laboratory is a mobile one, and it studies the story of a road movie, though not a contemporary one. A road movie that also refers to a recipe of gastronomic and cultural syncretism in the Tibetan world. The story begins right here, at the Great Stupa of Boudhanath, where a large part of Nepal's Sherpa community now lives, and many of them dream of living in New York. Until the middle of the last century, Tibetan traders, many of them from the legendary warrior lineage of the Kampas, who travelled these roads carrying tea, salt and spices, would stop at the monument to rest, pray for a safe journey back, and give thanks upon arriving from the mountains. So, the deep historical connection between nomads and Boudhanath Stupa is because, in the 1950s, Tibetan refugees settled in the surrounding area, turning it into the heart of Tibetan Buddhism outside Tibet. However, this is not just a story about nomads and Tibetans, but also about farmers and the Chinese, as it has its origins in the fertile province of Yunnan, and specifically in one of the best-known symbols of Chinese culture, tea. And tea originated in Yunnan province thanks to its subtropical climate, moderate altitude, and abundant rainfall, where the plants grew into trees. Estimated to be between 3,200 and 3,600 years old, the oldest is a large tree found in a small, remote village in the mountains of Yunnan, and it still produces tea. Originally known as Chama Gudao, the ancient Tea Horse Road had its origins in these lands near the ancient city of Dali. From here, first on foot and then by mule and on horseback, the tea travelled across these lowland areas, ascending towards the highlands of Yunnan, where it passed through valleys and territories inhabited by ethnic minorities, who today form part of the colourful mosaic of China's 56 nationalities. Although it may still be necessary for the Han supermajority, especially the younger generation, to gain a better understanding of these ethnic groups in order to respect them as they deserve. Because what indigenous minorities need is not to be supplanted, but rather as minorities, and therefore with less power, yet with their own right to their culture and territory, to be properly protected and preserved by those who are stronger, just as we would do with our children and elderly people. Leaving behind the subtropical region dedicated to tea cultivation, among other crops, one reaches the mid-mountain zone, where barley was, and still is, the most prized cereal. The barley is roasted and then ground, either in water mills or, more recently, in modern mills machines such as this one, run by an entrepreneur from the Hui Muslim ethnic group. The barley flour then enters the Tibetan cultural sphere, where, like everything else there, it is regarded as sacred. And finally, it reaches the Drokpas, that is, the inhabitants of the higher lands, a term synonymous in this part of the world with nomad. This is a world of silence, interrupted only by the barking of guard dogs, the muffled grunts of yaks, the sound of the wind or the rain, and the quiet chatter of the nomads. However, following successive political and economic reforms, the Drokpas ceased to be nomads some decades ago, with some becoming semi-nomads and others agro-pastoralists. It is here that the culinary syncretism known as sampa takes place, when barley flour is first combined with yak butter and finally with tea, to which milk has been added beforehand. But sampa is not merely the result of 3 different ecological levels being transformed into food. It is also a profound symbol of Tibetan identity, and that of other related ethnic groups too, reflecting a shared way of life and understanding of life in a same world dominated by high altitudes. But we cannot leave these lands without learning the fundamental lesson that Tibetan pastoralism offers us. The what matters is not so much the practices themselves as that sense of belonging to natural environments. That pastoralism is not something isolated or self-contained, that it forms part of a greater whole, and that this way of understanding its relationship with nature is what links pastoralism to other similar ways of life. Meanwhile, the monsoon continues to nourish the eastern part of Asia, including East Tibet. The rivers continue to flow from their sacred sources on the high plateau to the tropical lowlands. They will pass through equally iconic places, such as the Golden Triangle, and eventually they will die to feed something bigger, while still sheltering and nourishing other cultures and ecosystems. But that is another story to tell.
United by eco-mobility.
It is this deep connection that Tibetan pastoralism has with its natural world that leads to discover those same connections in other equally vital ecosystems, at a time when institutions are talking more about pastoralism. Because it is by looking beyond pastoralism that we discover another way of understanding nomadism, not so much by their various practices, but through an understanding of their homelands, of what their homelands were and continue to be, despite having been occupied and drastically altered by invasive human species. It must first be understood that nomadic tradition peoples occupied a much larger area than any other type of society at the beginning of the modern era. That is, just over 5 centuries ago, albeit with a low population density. Furthermore, although cities are now home to around 55% of the world's population, they cover only between 2 and 3% of the Earth's total land area. Yet it is there that decisions are taken which have a major impact on all living beings on the planet. That is despite the fact that cities are responsible for 70% of global pollutant emissions, driven mainly by transport, construction, and industry. From the side of nomadic tradition peoples, their current population is estimated at between 30 and 40 million people. This represents less than 10% of the 476 million indigenous peoples, and just 0.5% of the world's total population, which stands in sharp contrast to their vast geographical distribution and extraordinary diversity. It is therefore completely impossible, in just over an hour, to summarize such stunning variety and richness. But we can at least offer an insight into the great scale of their biocultural heritage. The Sahara Desert is the original homeland of the nomadic Berber or Amazigh pastoralists, in particular the various Tuareg confederations, just as the Middle East is for the various Arabic-speaking Bedouin tribes. The Pular-speaking Fulani, Pule or Fula herders, who exhibit varying degrees of mobility, are Muslims, and their traditional region is the Sahel. East Africa is home to a wide variety of pastoral tribes, including nomadic groups in desert areas who speak Cushitic languages, and semi-nomadic and agro-pastoral groups of Nilotic origin, mainly in the savanna regions. The Congo Basin, the world's second largest tropical rainforest, has been inhabited for tens of thousands of years by mobile hunter-gatherers, known generically as pygmies, including groups such as the Mbenga, the Mbuti, and the Batwa. The Khoisan, one of the world's oldest ethnic groups, are the ancient inhabitants of southern Africa, mostly nomadic hunter-gatherers, particularly associated with the Kalahari Desert, and now neighbours of more recent pastoralist groups, such as the Ovahimba. The Eurasian Arctic is home to reindeer herding peoples who move between the tundra and the taiga, whilst also preserving their ancient traditions of fishing and gathering. To the west, the Finno-Ugric Sami and the Samoyedic Nenets of the Ural-Altaic family. In the north-central region, Tungusic peoples such as the Evenki, and in the far northeast, the Chukchi and Koryaks, who speak Paleo-Asiatic languages. The Eurasian steppe has been the cradle of legendary nomadic horsemen, such as the Huns and the Mongols. The latter remains synonymous with steppe nomadism, as 25% of Mongolia's total population is still engaged in traditional mobile pastoralism. The High Asia region is also characterized by pastoralism on grasslands, but at higher altitudes and on more rugged terrain, which requires adaptation on the part of both the animals, with the yak as their totem animal, and its people, as Tibetans as the region's most representative ethnic group, whilst the Kyrgyz, who are of Turkic-Mongolian ethnicity, are found further to the west. In the successive mountainous and desert areas of Southwest Asia, peoples of Turkish or Iranian descent are engaged in pastoralism too, ranging from a nomadic to a semi-nomadic way of life. Small ruminants are particularly common in the mountains, for example, amongst the various Kurdish tribes, whilst camels are found in desert areas, such as amongst the Kutchis of Afghanistan. Australia is a continent characterised by various forms of foraging economies, with no pastoralism whatsoever until the arrival of the British. The same can be said of the related groups in Papua New Guinea and Tasmania. With 500 distinct nations or tribes and varying degrees of mobility, the Australian Aborigines have been recognised as a whole as the oldest continuous living culture on Earth. The North American Arctic is the homeland of the Inuit, also known as the Seal people, whose traditional nomadic way of life, based on hunting and fishing, has now been confined to certain remote enclaves. The subarctic region, like the rest of the Americas, was mainly characterized by survival strategies based on hunting, fishing, and gathering. The northernmost and westernmost parts are home to Na-Dene-speaking communities, whilst those in the centre and east are Algonquian-speaking. The famous Plains Indians, horse-riding hunters and gatherers, victims of genocide and the systematic slaughter of bison by invading populations, now live marginalised on reservations, as do the peoples of the Great Basin, whose economy was more diversified. It is estimated that between 400 and 500 indigenous tribes live in the Amazon and Orinoco river basins, most of whom are horticulturists who also hunt, fish and gather. Nomadism here is largely strategic due to the many external pressures, particularly amongst the approximately 150 tribes living in voluntary isolation or without contact with the outside world. The indigenous peoples of the Gran Chaco, who originally relied on a variety of foraging practices, were subjected to policies designed to force them to settle in a sedentary manner, with programs aimed at compelling them to take up farming and to work in the forestry and sugar industries as cheap labour. The campaigns waged against the nomadic hunter-gatherer and fisher-gatherer populations of Patagonia in Argentina, particularly the Tehuelches and the Selknam, can also be described as genocide. Whereas in the case of the canoeists of Chile, we would be talking more of a policy of assimilation. To all this must be added other, more scattered groups, such as various transhumant communities in South America, Europe and Asia, or small groups of hunter-gatherers who consequently have a limited environmental impact but are of enormous ecological importance, such as the Adivasi of Sri Lanka and India, and the Negritos of Southeast Asia, along with other, more remote groups. Finally, there are the sea nomads, who once lived on small boats, and many of whom now live in stilt settlements, notably the Bajau. An even simpler, and perhaps more poetic, way of understanding nomadism in the natural world is through its most pressing environmental adaptations, just as we would do with other communities of living beings. In this sense, 5 natural elements – water, trees, grass, mountains, and emptiness have decisively shaped these adaptations, beyond the need for these communities to move on from time to time. We thus have aquatic communities, forest communities, grassland communities, mountain communities, and finally, desert communities. As previously seen, nomadic indigenous mountain communities are mainly engaged in pastoralism or agropastoralism, as the difficulties involved in moving around in mountain areas and the greater dispersion of resources make gathering and hunting difficult, whilst the abundance of rivers makes agriculture possible. With the near annihilation of the indigenous horse-riding hunter-gatherer tribes in the Americas, both on the North American Great Plains and in the South American Pampas and Patagonia, the natural grasslands that have not yet been subjected to industrial agricultural and livestock systems have remained almost exclusively the domain of pastoralist peoples, and, in the exceptional case of Mongolia, as communal land where free movement is protected, allowing for the traditional use of the land without fences or private divisions. Forests are not generally the ideal environment for pastoralism due to their lack of extensive grazing areas, except in the case of the taiga, where reindeer feed on lichens. Furthermore, in the boreal forest, the trees provide protection from the extreme cold of the often windy tundra, supplying firewood, game, and wild fruits, as well as materials for building huts and tents, and other elements, like boxes, such as birch bark. The tropical forest is a biome particularly well suited to a combination of mobile subsistence models based on hunting, fishing, gathering, and shifting cultivation. However, it is also under serious threat due to its extraordinary natural wealth and external pressure to expand agricultural areas. The region of Southeast Asia is home to some of the world's oldest tropical forests, as well as various communities with nomadic traditions, which are now severely affected by a range of factors, notably the massive expansion of oil palm plantations over recent decades. This is the case with the Orang Rimba communities in Sumatra. Most notably, it is also the case of the Penan, well known for their long-standing struggle to defend their ecological culture and ancestral territory in the ancient rainforests of Borneo, brought to international attention by Survival International and the activist Bruno Manza, who mysteriously disappeared there in 2000. Added to this are mining operations, hydroelectric and urbanization projects, the logging industry, and mass tourism, primarily domestic tourism in countries with large populations, such as Indonesia. Victims of this include the Togutil people of Halmahera Island in the northern Moluccas, the Batak people of Palawan Island in the Philippines, all the Orang Asli of the Malaysian Peninsula, particularly those who continue to practice their nomadic traditions, the Jahai in the border region with Thailand, and the Batek around Taman Negara National Park. Some of which are already included in the tourist package, offering that exotic, tribal flavour. Other, more remote groups often suffer frequent attacks by wild elephants, which are undoubtedly more agitated than usual due to a lack of space and growing external pressure.
Very dangerous for elephant, the jungle elephant. But long time ago, my grandfather, no problem to do like that for the elephant. But now, no. I think we have
But this Batek hunter, who learnt some English after guiding foreigners through the jungle for years, also tells us how the economy no longer depends on the rainforest.
You have in the jungle not Batek in the jungle, but now we have every Batek distinct from across the river like this, but we have not many do food, find food of the buy from the local people. Long time ago, yes, many people in the jungle, but they find food of the jungle. They bring digging stick, they bring blowpipe for hunting, with point for the tubers, jam, and everything food in the jungle, yeah. But now, no, we have from the buy sugar, we buy biscuit, yeah. We buy everything, buy from the bread, the local people like this. The shop, yeah, the point food, this one, yeah. I like for one, yeah. Not for two. And then when they go hunting, for the bring the this more bamboo. But this not long time to do, but when they hunting this, yeah, we put okay strong here, strong food. The poison from the tree, yeah, we collect from the tree. The poison, yeah, the sap from the tree. We call rubber, yeah, the rubber from the tree.
Finally, there are the small, highly vulnerable communities living in the remaining pockets of forest in Thailand, Vietnam and Laos. The Manik, known locally as the Sakais, meaning slaves or savages, some of whom still live a nomadic life in their traditional huts. The Arem and Chut, who lived in caves not so long ago, have now been settled in villages that are difficult to access, though they still slip away from them to return to the jungle. And finally, the Mlabri, or as they are known in Thailand, Phi Tong Lueng, meaning ghosts of the yellow leaves, who now live a settled life in villages due to the loss of their forests. Mainly as a result of the expansion of the Hmong farmers, a large ethnic group from northern Indochina. This shows that being indigenous is not synonymous with being environmentally friendly, when so many are competing for the same territory. The only surviving nomadic Mlabri group lives in the jungles of Nam Phui National Park in western Laos, grappling with the decision of whether to remain nomadic or to embrace agriculture, which is encroaching ever closer. This, too, is the story of many hunter-gatherer communities around the world. The story of the spirit of the yellow leaves disappearing forever. Deserts have been, and continue to be, the domain of nomadic pastoralists, whether they are torrid deserts or frozen deserts, the latter also known as the tundra. However, numerous hunter-gatherer populations have also managed to survive in these extreme environments without fundamentally altering these particularly fragile ecosystems, such as the Australian Aborigines, or the Inuit, who continue to hunt sporadically despite the orchestrated campaigns against them by the environmental organisation Greenpeace, headquartered in the Netherlands, a country heavily involved in both industrial fishing and the diamond trade, not to mention being the European Union's leading importer of palm oil. Diamonds also form the backdrop to the demise of the traditional hunter-gatherer economy in the central Kalahari amongst the San, also known as the Bushmen, as they were relocated in villages outside their traditional foraging grounds. And this is despite the fact that the San are considered to represent one of the oldest and best preserved cultures and genetic lineages of Homo sapiens on the planet. Water covers 70% of our planet's surface and is essential for life. Yet very few human communities have made water their home. Most of us have turned the sea, lakes and rivers into a recurring and seemingly inexhaustible source of resources, as well as a place for leisure. Whilst at the same time drawing boundaries there too, even though we cannot erect fences on the water. Once again, it has been nomadic tradition communities that have been able to adapt to life on the water, and once again, without significantly damaging aquatic ecosystems, eventually becoming part of them. Yet, once again, it is they who have been marginalised, as if those who care for nature were to be punished. As if being patriots of nature, rather than patriots of any artificially created political entity, were a crime. This is what happened to the nomadic canoeists of the southernmost region of the Americas, the Yagan, the Kawashkar, and the Chonos. First, European and Creole fleets engaged in seal hunting depleted their main source of food, whilst also introducing diseases unknown to them. Then, the missions and estates put an end to their traditional mobility by canoe, forcing them into a sedentary way of life. An interesting example of the survival of a semi-nomadic seafaring tradition is provided by the Imragouen of Mauritania in the Banc d'Arguin National Park, where fishermen continue to practice low-impact fishing in traditional, non-motorised sailing boats in exchange for exclusive fishing rights. And so, they move from village to village along the coast, depending on the circumstances. But when it comes to traditional, nomadic, water-dwelling peoples, the waters of Southeast Asia are undoubtedly their most significant habitat. On the southern and southeastern coasts of China live the Danjia, meaning the egg family, a reference to the fragility of their traditional boats, the sampans, in the face of the region's frequent tropical typhoons. Today, they have developed a small-scale floating aquaculture industry in parts of their traditional coastal territory. In Cambodia, various groups of river people live. The nomadic Cham Muslims are reluctant to leave the banks of the Mekong in the vicinity of Phnom Penh, despite growing urban development pressure. The Cham and the Vietnamese share a floating way of life on the stretches of river flowing from the Great Tonle Lake, the largest freshwater body in Southeast Asia. Some live in veritable floating villages anchored to the riverbed, whilst others, who are semi-nomadic, live on boats that are forced to run aground during the dry season. However, the most famous, almost legendary nomadic seafaring peoples in this part of the world are the so-called sea nomads, or sea gypsies, who live in seas that were once dominated by pirates, with whom they coexisted and still coexist. Moken myths tell of how a great flood led them to build boats and set out to sea, and how this became their way of life. But these legendary tales may be linked to the massive ice melt that took place at the end of the last ice age, which is also recounted in the Bible. Today, the Moken are a stateless people living along the coasts of Myanmar and Thailand in the Andaman Sea. Originally underwater hunters and coastal gatherers, the forced sedentarization resulting from their integration into national and regional political and economic systems not only compels them to live in villages on stilts, but also to resort to net fishing to survive within the new order. The Orang Salita, considered the oldest inhabitants of the Singapore region, who lived in estuaries, rivers and mangroves, suffered gradual and forced displacement due to rapid urbanization, the destruction of the mangroves, and strict border controls. Today they live scattered across stilt villages on the Malay coast of the Straits of Johor. The Orang Suku Laut, that is, the people of the sea, inhabit the Indonesian archipelagos of Riau and Lingga. They traditionally lived on small boats known as sampan kajang, featuring a distinctive retractable reed roof, where they cooked, slept, and raised their children. Historically, they engaged in trade and the protection of maritime traffic, yet colonial powers unfairly associated to piracy, which, by the way, still exists, for example in the Strait of Malacca, through which around 30% of the world's trade in goods and oil passes. In recent decades, the Indonesian government has viewed their nomadic lifestyle as a sign of backwardness, pressuring them to adopt the dominant Malay culture and official religions, such as Islam. As a result of this policy, young people are abandoning their seafaring traditions out of shame due to social discrimination. Their traditional method of fishing involves hunting with a long, four-pronged harpoon from the deck of their boats. More recently, following the forced end to their nomadic way of life, they have turned to fishing with nets and producing charcoal from mangroves. The Bajau inhabit the Sulu, Celebes and Banda seas, living either on boats or in stilt houses over the water, and dedicate much of their lives to artisanal fishing, traditionally involving freediving with a spear. Thanks to a genetically inherited adaptation to the aquatic environment, they can dive to depths of 60 or 70 meters and hold their breath for over 10 to 13 minutes, aided by an enlarged spleen. And like the Moken, because they lack a permanent residence on land, they hold no citizenship or official documents from any country. This cuts off any access they might have to the decision-making level, while their own culture and economy are impacted by large-scale industrial fishing and border restrictions. Sea nomads should receive far greater attention and care, and an urgent need exists for a cross-border regional plan to safeguard them, empowering them to act as guides and guardians of their ancestral regions, as they live within or near the world's most biodiverse marine area. Known as the Coral Triangle, this aquatic ecosystem is home to over 76% of the planet's coral species and 37% of its reef fish species.
Future.
At the end of this journey, we must address the future of nomads, which is also the future of their ecosystems and ultimately our own future.
It remains, however, to mention those traditional nomads who are not part of a natural ecosystem, but who live straddling the line between rural life and sedentary urban life, those whom we used to call peripatetic or itinerant. In West Africa, the griot, or Joel, is an oral historian, musician and poet whose profession, vital for preserving genealogies and traditions, is both itinerant and hereditary. We could also call them nomads of time, who bridge the past and the present, bringing us intangible traditions that would have been lost without them. However, they evoke in us that same mixed feeling of attraction and aversion as other nomads, or perhaps even more so, as they live so close to us. Peripatetics can also be found in Old Europe as a legacy of the medieval past. Just as in Asia Minor, where it is still possible to hear the ashiks, a bardic tradition practiced by wandering minstrels that dates back over 1,000 years and has its roots in the ancient shamanic beliefs of the Turkic peoples. Whilst still in Anatolia, we visited the Dom community, whose families usually work as agricultural day labourers during the harvest season. And back in Europe, we find their Romani relatives, or, as we tend to call them in Western Europe, the Gypsies, scattered across virtually the whole of Europe, in groups ranging from the poorest to the richest, the Gabor of Romania, the aristocratic caste of the Gypsies. Although, shamefully, there is not a single museum or institution in the world dedicated to traditional nomadic cultures, the Gypsies have at least one museum. Their puppets take us back to the origins of all these people, the Rom, the Dom, and the Lom. In their countries of origin, India and Pakistan, they are generically known as Kanabadosh, which means those who carry their homes on their backs. Furthermore, there they far outnumber the nomadic pastoralist peoples, engaged in a wide variety of occupations performed in an ambulant way. Snake catchers and charmers.
I am a snake charmer, but everything snake charmer. One week here, 1 week another country, 1 week new place. Change.
Two colors. You look two colors. Viper, that's Piton.
I was saying snake catchers and charmers, artisans, traders, blacksmiths, epic singers. They too, like other nomadic tradition people, are in danger of disappearing, and with them an intangible cultural heritage of incalculable value, in a world ruled by mass media and mobile phones.
In his book, The Other Side of Eden, the British anthropologist Hugh Brodie attributes to agriculture the title of the most mobile and also the most unstable way of life of all, due to its innate tendency to cause overpopulation and its innate propensity for colonialism and war. However, those we call nomads do not readily abandon their own ecoregions, even though they move within them to live off what nature produces naturally, whether through gathering, hunting, or relying on other animals that follow natural migratory patterns. It is precisely this natural dependence that regulates population levels and has created a balance shared by all living beings for millions of years. It was upon these two pillars, the predatory territorial dynamics of sedentary peoples and the nomads' loyalty to their ecosystems through mobility, that the principle of terra nullius was established, which served as a pretext for the invasion and plundering of many territories, whether by European powers in the past or by other powers at a regional level more recently. There is no doubt that the United Nations has been and continues to be a positive force on the world stage. Agencies such as the FAO, IFAD, and UNEP have supported nomadic peoples, particularly pastoralists. And yet, there is still no specific international legislation that protects their unique status. This explains, for example, why Western Sahara remains under the control of an invading country, supported by the United States, despite the landmark advisory opinion issued in 1975 by the International Court of Justice against the erroneous use of the concept of terra nullius. It is clear that there is enormous international pressure to prevent these peoples from legally reclaiming the territories to which they are rightfully entitled, given the great wealth of natural resources they possess. For example, by applying the oldest and simplest of legal principles, customary law. Just as the European settlers in the United States, paradoxically, succeeded in doing. It also seems clear that the process of appropriation and overexploitation that began with the development of agriculture 10,000 years ago is now reaching very worrying limits. UNEP, one of the United Nations agencies, estimates that no less than 75% of the Earth's land area and 66% of the world's oceans have been significantly altered or degraded by human activity. Despite the imminent threat of a serious climate crisis in a few decades' time, states, and we ourselves, remain determined to continue with a competition that has already spread to every sphere of life, as long as there is money to be made from it. Currently, there are between 110 and 130 active armed conflicts worldwide, the highest figure since the end of the Second World War, and double the number of 15 years ago. Not to mention the unprecedented rise in environmental conflicts, the number of which is estimated at least 4,000. Nomads can therefore do little to counter this global inertia, other than to remain faithful to their homelands and traditional ways of life as far as possible. So, either we do something truly substantial about it, or nature will do it, as it always has, swallowing up all those civilizations that believe themselves to be eternal. More comprehensive solutions are therefore needed, in line with the new challenges. Something similar to the Arctic Council, which brings together governments, experts, and indigenous peoples by biocultural regions, but with greater decision-making power and the ability to secure binding commitments. This also illustrates, amongst the Madic tradition peoples themselves, that unity is better than division based on practices. It matters little whether some are herders and others hunters or gatherers, provided that both share values and respect for the same biome. And in this way, perhaps, we can ensure that once again, our most precious natural assets remain in good hands, for the benefit of future generations. Therefore, it depends on all of us, to some extent, to either allow the civilized world to continue devouring natural ecosystems, or set limits to this voracity, allowing and helping nomadic tradition communities to continue fulfilling their role as patriots of nature.